We are only 18 days away from the 2025 NFL Draft, so in today's video, we're going to be talking about the 8 hidden gems of the 2025 NFL Draft. Subscribe if you're new and enjoy the video. Let's hop into it. So starting off at number 8, I have Damian Martinez, the running back from Miami. There's a lot to like about Damian Martinez. Before we get a bit more into Damian, I do want to say this. There are a lot of really underrated players in this year's draft class, but these are 8 players specifically that I do personally believe should be drafted a lot higher than kind of what the consensus is with them. With that said, getting back to Damian Martinez, Martinez is a well-sized physical style running back that you really don't see NFL teams coveting as much as they probably should be coveting. Typically, when we talk about what makes up for a good running back, we always like to talk about shiftiness, athleticism, downfield speed, the ability to make big plays out of nothing, and sometimes you just need a guy who can be a bit more of a true workhorse-styled running back. When I look at Damian Martinez, is he the fastest guy on the field? No. Is he the biggest guy on the field? No. He ran like a 4.51 at the combine, weighed in about 6 foot 217. So this guy, you know, in terms of the physical and athletic profile, he's not blowing away anybody. But what I personally like about Damian Martinez is he's a decisive runner. He's big, strong, physical, can churn out tough yards. I think he's solid in the pass game and has a little bit more room to grow there. And the way I view Damian Martinez is I think that he is the perfect complement to a more speedster style running back. So I know I make this comparison a lot in this in the NFL and just with a lot of videos, but the Detroit Lions kind of have the perfect 1-2 punch at running backs. You have David Montgomery, who's a bit more of your brawly style guy, a bit more of your physical presence, who can churn out some tough yards, get you into the end zone, and, you know, convert those 3rd and 2 when you decide to run on 3rd and 2. Whereas for Jahmyr Gibbs, he's the opposite of that. He's a bit more of your speedster, your home run hitter. He can hit the hole and make a 5-yard gain from a small hole, turn it into a 15-yard gain just based off his pure athleticism. So for me, for Damian Martinez, I kind of view him as being a bit more in the mode of like that David Montgomery style of running back. I'm not saying that I'm comparing him to David Montgomery, but in terms of what I see his play style being at the NFL level, I see Damian Martinez being a perfect complement to a more speedster style guy. So if you look at this year's draft class, another running back that I think is underrated but not included in this video is a guy in Brashel Tutin, who I think was the fastest running back in this year's class. Don't quote me on that, but I know ran exceptionally well and is just incredibly fast at his position. Hypothetically speaking, if you did draft Damian Martinez in rounds 3, 4, or 5, wherever he ends up going, and then somehow you double it up by taking Tutin, then you pair Tutin next to Damian Martinez, and I kind of think that's the ideal combination you want to put next to Damian Martinez. You want to put Damian Martinez in a situation where he is not a 3-down guy. Rather, he is somebody who can play opposite of somebody else. And I think Martinez will succeed at a very high level at the NFL level. Moving on to my next player is going to be Jimmy Horn, the wide receiver out of Colorado. Now, it feels like whenever I see any of these hidden gem styled videos, a lot of times I have been seeing the names of either LeJontay Wester or Jimmy Horn. These are both Colorado receivers who kind of played as 2nd or sometimes 3rd fiddle to, of course, Travis Hunter. Now, I'll say this, productivity-wise, Jimmy Horn was not the most productive player in 2024, but to me, I don't really blame too much of that on Jimmy Horn. Rather, I put a lot of the blame on just Travis Hunter being that much of a total freak that he can play both sides at such an extremely high level and be the go-to receiver for Shedeur Sanders. Jimmy Horn, though, I thought looked fantastic on the field. He's a bit of a slender build guy. He's not a big dude, but he's a dude who runs extremely well, extremely athletic. I think he's a solid enough route runner. And when he runs his routes, he's not somebody who slows down. Like sometimes you have these really fast dudes who, yes, they can run a 4.3, but when it comes to running a 4.3 in route, they don't do that. And I kind of do think that Jimmy Horn sometimes is capable of doing that, where he doesn't slow down when he turns to, you know, cut on his routes. Like he is somebody who's always running extremely well. And I do think at his size, he doesn't ever really possess wide receiver 1 qualities. But if you pair him opposite of a really dominant wide receiver 1, kind of like he was at with Colorado, I think Jimmy Horn could be a really good day 3 guy who could be a potential wide receiver 2, but more than likely sticks in probably is just a traditional wide receiver 3. Again, this is somebody where his game depends heavily on his speed. His ability to create separation is largely due to the fact that he is extremely athletic and moves well. He also is a solid contested catch guy, so it's not like he's just just a, I hate to make this comparison because I don't want to lessen some other prospect, but of course, when John Ross came out a few years ago, his whole game was based off speed. I guess the same thing can also be said about Jalen Hyatt, where those guys were speed demons, but really had nothing else to their game. I wouldn't say that Jimmy Horn is as fast as those guys, but Jimmy Horn has a lot more to his game than just pure speed. Yes, he can win deep just off of pure speed. He has that in his tool set, but at the same time, he can also create separation because of his speed. He can win some contested catches. Granted, I don't think that'll be necessarily his forte in the NFL level, but he can if it is, given an opportunity. And I think after the catch, I also think there's a lot of potential there because of his pure athleticism and creative skills. So for Jimmy, I see somebody who is relentless to get the ball. I think he's a really solid player. Not really much of a diva. He played next to Travis Hunter, and you barely ever heard a peep out of him, despite the fact that for a lot of other college teams out there, maybe not the top tier teams, but some really good teams, he'd probably be considered their go-to guy. So for Jimmy Horn, I think in some ways he's not going to be drafted terribly high because teams are going to look at his slender build and lack of productivity. But I think instead, if you look at what he's done on the field when maybe not given the opportunity to make a play and just what he can become at the NFL level, you're looking at somebody who I think could be potentially one of those hidden gems that get taken later in the draft and at some point ends up building a nice spot for a team and being a part of a receiver rotation where he is on the field a whole heck of a lot. However, moving on to my next player is going to be Danny Stutsman, the Oklahoma linebacker. And yes, you see that Texas flag right there. I am a UT Longhorn fan, so it does pay me to see Danny Stutsman, who notoriously put the Hook'em Horns down and has been a big time Texas hater his entire career. Regardless of all that, I still think Danny Stutsman's a heck of a player that should be drafted probably somewhere early day 3, potentially even as late or as early as even maybe late day 2. Danny Stutsman is about 6'3", 233, around about a 4.5 at the combine, so not necessarily the most explosive player. He's not a freak athlete who's going to run a 4.3. I think the bread and butter for Danny Stutsman is that he's just a extremely intelligent player who's solid in coverage, especially zone coverage. I found him to be really solid at that. The flaws to his game is that he isn't the greatest against like offensive linemen. When an offensive lineman gets to the second level and puts their hands on Danny Stutsman, a lot of the time Danny's not necessarily somebody who can get off of those blocks. He's not really somebody who initiates contact on those offensive linemen. Rather, he's a bit more of like a receiver in that sort of context where he's the one taking the punishment, not necessarily the opposite way around. However, based off his IQ, he is somebody who can shoot gaps to create big time disruptions. He's also somebody who doesn't fall for RPOs, does not fall for play action fakes. He is an incredibly smart player, and I think that's ultimately what gets him to become a solid interior linebacker for whatever team does take him. Again, I think he's excellent in coverage, and I think that's going to go a long way at the NFL level. And because I think that he can be good against the run because of his IQ, that I think that does give him a ceiling to be a starting caliber linebacker for whatever team takes him. He's not a great athlete, but he's also not a poor athlete. He ran a 4.5, which is totally fine for the NFL level. He also has that prototypical size where you see him on the field and he looks like a true linebacker. So at the NFL level, you're looking at somebody who I think has good IQ, moves quite nicely, solid in coverage, will be a disruptor in play action, will be a disruptor in RPOs. And I think that's the making of somebody who can potentially become a starting linebacker at the NFL level. And again, we're talking about he's not going to be drafted on day 1 or probably not even day 2. So if you're taking him in the 4th, 5th, maybe 3rd round, I think you're getting a guy who can start for you, which a day 3 guy, how often can you actually say that that guy has a chance to start for you? I think with Danny Stutsman, you are getting the guy who can do that because of how smart this dude truly is. Prototypical size, moves nicely. So I like Danny Stutsman. Again, I know I'm a Texas fan, so there might be a little bit of some innate hatred towards Danny Stutsman, but I always try to take the man out of the uniform when I'm watching film or watching highlights or seeing breakdowns of certain players. So when that does happen, and I'm just watching the player himself, not the OU on his helmet, I look at Danny Stutsman and I say that is a fantastic player that 90% of college teams would have loved to have on their roster. Heck, even my Texas Longhorns next to Anthony Hill would have loved to have Danny Stutsman. Unfortunately, he's on the wrong side of the river, so I don't like him as a player, but as a prospect, as a player, Danny Stutsman is a fantastic guy who gave Texas a lot of fits in his career. So Danny Stutsman is at my number 6. Let's move on to my number 5, which is going to be Kobe Bryant, the cornerback from Kansas. Now, Kobe Bryant is a slender built guy, only 6 foot, 180 pounds at the combine, only ran a 4.5, which you'd like to see him maybe rank a little bit higher in the 40-yard dash department. With that all said, I think he is extremely competitive. He's one of those guys who, I don't know what it is with him, but this dude is always talking. Like I don't know if maybe I was just seeing things, but from everything I've heard, Kobe Bryant is a talkative guy who is what we would like to call a dog. I mean, every single analysis that I've seen of Kobe Bryant, when I kind of double check to make sure I'm seeing a prospect right, everyone calls him the same thing. They call him a dog, despite the fact that he's not necessarily a big guy. He's a bit more of a wiry framed guy. This dude absolutely is willing to take on tackles. He talks trash, and I kind of like that for my corner. Because he is a smaller, more wiry framed guy, this is somebody who probably will struggle to stick in man against bigger physical receivers. Like we all kind of saw what happened to Emmanuel Forbes when he went up against AJ Brown. I could see a world where if Kobe Bryant was put on a mismatch in press man coverage against AJ Brown or DK Metcalf, or one of those big physical receivers that can make big plays, I could see Kobe Bryant struggling against those guys. With that said, I don't personally view Kobe Bryant as maybe even potentially sticking out as an outside corner. I think he has flexibility to play outside or nickel at the NFL level, but because of his size, I don't think you're really going to put him in too much press man coverage or just man coverage situations too often. He's really solid in zone. He's got ball productivity. Like this guy is always trying to get the football out of the player's hand. He's trying to create turnovers, trying to make big plays. But because he is so thin and wiry, I do think his ceiling is a little bit limited. I don't ever see him truly becoming a go-to cornerback one option unless he puts on a little bit of some weight, a little bit of extra muscle. Because as I mentioned, what you want out of a typical cornerback one is somebody who can handle more physical receivers. Like Jalen Ramsey is a cornerback one. Why? Well, he can handle all sorts of receivers. He has the speed, the ball skills, the productivity, and he can handle the AJs and the DK Metcalfs because, well, he has the size to do so. There was kind of a reason why Forbes did not work out at the NFL level. Now, Kobe Bryant is a lot bigger than Emmanuel Forbes. Forbes was extremely wiry and did not weigh a ton. Bryant has some meat on his bones. He's not as skinny as Emmanuel Forbes, but again, at the NFL level, I think maybe adding 5-10 pounds to get him closer to like 190, put on some muscle and be able to kind of use your length to your advantage, and maybe he could handle some bigger physical receivers, maybe not every play, but hold his own at that point. One thing I really like about Kobe Bryant, and I kind of talked about it a bit earlier, I think that he can stick in to play nickel. I think he is really solid in zone. And again, he's one of those dudes who's always trying to make plays in the football. So I think that does translate a smidge better at the nickel position, where typically the nickel isn't going up against physical receivers. They're more than likely going up against tight ends, or they're going up against slot receivers. And most times tight ends are not fast enough to use their physicality too much to their advantage against a guy like Kobe Bryant. And typically in the slot, you're talking about more smaller built receivers, sort of like a Cooper Kupp per se. So if you do move Kobe Bryant to play nickel and you put him in those situations, I think his athleticism could keep him in the ability to cover tight ends, though typically he'll probably just cover slot receivers. And against slot receivers, Kobe Bryant's length, his ball skills, his competitive nature, and that quote-unquote dog in him, I think will allow him to be a really solid nickel corner at the NFL level. But if he does stick to play outside, I think in zone he's solid enough, and I think in man coverage I've seen him be sticky enough to hold his own. It just kind of varies depending on what the matchup is for him. Again, if you put him against a physical receiver, he might struggle, but if you put him against maybe a smaller, less physical receiver, he could handle his own and make some nice plays on the football. So in terms of his ceiling, I'm seeing very good, solid cornerback 2/nickel starter. At his worst, he's maybe just a special teams guy. But let's go ahead and move on to my next player, which this is a player that a lot of people are starting to grow a little bit more hyped about, and that's Omar Norman Lott. Now, I want to say this about Omar. Do I think he's a first-round caliber guy? Maybe not. But an early day 2 guy, maybe a late day 1, I could definitely think that's a realistic spot for Omar Norman Lott to go. Omar Norman Lott is a very weird player in this year's draft. Good size, 6'2", 291, plays that interior defensive lineman mold. This guy is a weird guy because he didn't really play too much for Tennessee, and for a guy who was as productive as him, he didn't really get too much play time on the field. With that said, this dude is a fantastic pass rusher. He's quick off the ball, uses his hands very nicely, swipes, grabs, chops, all sorts of those sort of things. He can do so at an extremely high level. He isn't the biggest dude. Again, I talked about it, 6'something", 291 pounds. So you're not going to probably put him in there as a 3-down option because against the run, he might struggle a little bit against that. At Tennessee, he just didn't really play a whole bunch, which I think is sort of bizarre because of how good he was. And I didn't think he was terribly bad against the run. Like, he uses his feet nicely. He can get low and hold his own. Just at Tennessee, they did a lot of rotations in that defensive line, and it kind of limited the player that he ultimately became. What do I think Omar Norman-Lott can become at the NFL level? I think he's somebody who can get you 6-7 sacks on a season and potentially be solid against the run. He's kind of a big risk if you do take him in the earlier portion of the draft, but if you take him on day 2, I think the rest does become a little bit less of a burden. If you're a team that has good run stuffers up the middle and just feels like they need maybe a bit more of a disruptor who can get to the quarterback out of that position, Omar Norman-Lott could be that guy. I think some teams that could be a bad fit for him would be a team like Dallas or a team like Buffalo or some teams like that already have guys who can get to the quarterback, but instead really just need somebody who can, sit in there and be dominant against the run. Again, I think Omar can do that. It's just that we haven't seen it too often because of how much that Tennessee rotates their defensive linemen. Not to mention he's also undersized. But if you are a team that, like I mentioned, already has a number of good physical, maybe big, strong defensive tackles that can stuff the run, but maybe just need a bit more of a, more athletic, more pass rush oriented defensive tackle, then Omar Norman-Lott could very well be that guy. Again, I do think first round hype for him is maybe a little bit too rich in my personal point of view, but because he is a dominant pass rusher and ultimately the biggest thing you want to do is sack the quarterback, I could see a team taking a flyer on Omar Norman-Lott and just banking on him becoming a really good pass rusher at the NFL level and hoping that in terms of being a run defender, the size element won't be that big of an issue and that the very little that we saw from him at Tennessee doing that job, he can ultimately do that. So again, I like Omar Norman-Lott. I think it depends on what personnel a team has to build around him. But if you take him on day 2, if you already have some veteran run stuffers up the middle, I think Omar Norman-Lott could be a beautiful piece to add to a defensive line to just put some pressure on a quarterback. However, with that all said, let's move on to my next player, which is going to be Kyle Williams, the receiver out of Washington State. There's a lot to like about Kyle Williams. I think it's best to start off that we talk about some of his inefficiencies because those are some major things that will have some people concerned and maybe have him down the board a bit more. Arm length is a little bit to be desired. Hand size a little bit to be desired. He had some drops in the college level. I think a lot of them were just concentration drops rather than just not having good hands. I think his hands are fine when he makes sure that he pulls it all the way in. But again, his hands definitely do need to be improved upon. Route running, I don't think he sells his routes terribly well, but I think there's a good reason for it. But I think at the NFL level, he'll have to sell his routes a tad bit more. Those are kind of things that I saw that I don't like about him. But in terms of things that I do like about him, the dude is a playmaker. The dude is an athletic freak. Really well sized. And again, smaller arms than what you would like, but 5'11", 190, ran a 4.4 at the NFL draft combine. I thought on film he looked a lot faster. Like there are certain players who can run a 4.3 straight line speed, but Kyle Williams is somebody who can run a 4.4 at all levels, no matter if he's breaking, in breaking, running certain routes. Like he's always running extremely fast. Like this dude ran a lot of underneath stuff. He ran a lot of deep stuff, but some of the things that I thought were the most impressive of him was when he was doing things like jet sweeps. Everyone knew that it was coming and they couldn't stop it because of how athletic this dude is. Now, again, I talked about it a bit earlier. You look at a guy like Jalen Hyatt, for example, who is just pure speed and nothing else to his game. That is not Kyle Williams. It's the exact same thing as what I talked about with Jimmy Horn, who, again, kind of similar to Kyle Williams, a bit more of a speedster, but he also can move around really nicely. Like Jalen Hyatt does not have a deep route tree bag. It's simply a go ball or a post and stuff like that. Like he doesn't have much in the underneath game. Kyle Williams does have that. Now, again, I think he needs to sell his routes a bit more at the NFL level. It feels like at times because he is consistently getting past corners and safeties and causing havoc because of his pure speed that he can kind of not sell his routes as much because he beats them with speed. But at the NFL level against NFL corners who are physical, stronger, and just better in keeping in phase, he is going to have to sell his routes a little bit more. I see Kyle Williams as a late day 2, early day 3 option with upside to be a wide receiver 2, but likely will stick to being maybe more of a wide receiver 3. But you pair him opposite of a really good wide receiver 1, Kyle Williams' speed is going to cause a lot of problems for NFL defenses because he is capable of getting open. He's also somebody who, despite not having long arms or big hands, is extremely competitive and will go up to the catch point and try to make some plays out there. So in terms of all those details and all those things that I like about Kyle Williams, those things, in my opinion, overcome some of the concerns that I do have in his physical limitations and the drops he had at the college level. With that all said, I think this guy has extremely high ceiling. His floor is very very safe because I think that he is very likely to step in day one and be a starting caliber receiver on your team, maybe a third or fourth option. But if he reaches his ceiling, he can easily be a second option for a really good team. Moving on to my second hidden gem of the NFL draft is going to be Andrew Mukuba, the safety from Texas. Again, I talked about it a little bit earlier. Yes, I am a Texas fan, but I always try to separate the player from the guy in the jersey, especially when I'm talking about teams that I'm a fan of or maybe a team that I'm not a big fan of. In this context, Andrew Mukuba only played 1 year at Texas, and I watched film from him in Clemson and obviously his most recent year at Texas, and I saw a lot of the same player from this past year that I did at Clemson. So despite the tint of orange, he still played fantastic no matter where he was at. Andrew Mukuba to me has versatility to play more of a free safety, strong safety, and nickel role, which is extremely unique for a lot of these safeties you're potentially seeing get taken on day two. I love Andrew Mukuba. Again, I know I'm a Texas fan, so maybe I have an innate bias towards him, but again, I try to take the player out the jersey. Mukuba has experience. I think his awareness is fantastic. He's solid in coverage, smooth mover, fast. This dude is a playmaker. Like, there were some plays that he made at Texas where the ball is in the air and the ball is falling to the ground, and this guy finds a way to get the ball into his hands. He just made plays over and over and over again. Some of the flaws to his game, he's just a little bit undersized. He's only 5'11", 186 pounds, and he looks a little bit smaller on the field than what that might sound like. Like, he looks a bit more like 5'11", 180. So there is some room for him to grow. Maybe he put on some weight in the offseason, but I always kind of felt like Mukuba always looked a little bit undersized back there, which against NFL players, he's going to look a lot more undersized, even if he does put on a few pounds. Physically built wise, his arms are not the longest, so again, against more physical receivers, I could see him having some issues there. But I think his IQ, he moves very well. He's a very fluid mover, and because I think he's a willing tackler, I'm willing to overcome some of his physical limitations. Now, yes, in run support, I think he leaves a little bit to be desired. Again, I don't think it's necessarily because he's afraid of contact, because there was plenty of times out there against really good competition at Texas that he was flying downfield and, putting a beating on a tight end or receiver that was trying to make a catch. He had a play in specifically against Ohio State late into the college football playoffs where Jeremiah Smith was one-on-one against Andrew Mukuba, and Jeremiah Smith was the best receiver in college football last year, maybe besides like Travis Hunter, but even then I'd probably give it to Jeremiah Smith. And it was one-on-one Smith versus Andrew Mukuba. Will Howard throws a dot on I believe it was a post route, and Mukuba somehow, some way gets a stop on it despite being oversized, despite going up against a very talented, athletic, physical receiver like Jeremiah Smith. All that was done and said, Andrew Mukuba did not care. He got his hand up right in between the hands and mitts of Jeremiah Smith and patted the ball down, despite the fact that he had every disadvantage in the book in that game. I mean, I know Texas was doubling Jeremiah Smith a whole bunch in that game, but Emeka Egbuka was not destroying the Longhorns. Neither was Cornell Tate. Neither was Jeremiah Smith. Like that secondary for Texas, yes, it has some talented players, but Andrew Mukuba felt like he completed that secondary and allowed that secondary to go from being really good to, in my opinion, one of the best secondaries in the country last year. A big reason why it was Andrew Mukuba. I think he elevates any team's secondary instantly when he steps in there because of his IQ, his awareness, his ability to track the football well and make plays on the football. Again, one might be a little rich because I don't think he's good in run support because some physical limitations, and I think at times, sometimes he can maybe misread a running back and times can get a little juked out of position, which happens for all safeties, but I think Mukuba needs to work on that. So I see him as an early day two guy. Like, I would be willing to take him as early as pick like 45 and beyond that. So if you take him at 45, I think Mukuba is a fantastic player. I think he will be a starter at the NFL level, and if you're telling me that I'm getting a solid starter in the second and third round who can be on my team for 10 plus years, I'd absolutely take that. Last thing I'll say about Mukuba, I also think he can play within the slot / nickel because of his lack of size. He doesn't have to go up against physical receivers on the outside. Rather, he can stick in to play nickel, and I think his physical abilities and athleticism could easily have him succeed there. However, my biggest hidden gem of the 2025 NFL draft, and frankly, I think hidden might be a loose term in the context of who I'm talking about, but I'm talking about Braden Swinson, the LSU defensive end. I feel like if I made this video like 3 weeks ago, then this would be probably a bit more accurate of calling him a hidden gem, but it kind of does feel like a lot of teams and scouts and analysts are starting to get on the Braden Swinson train, so I feel like I'm a little bit late on this, but I was a bit earlier on it. Like, I had Braden Swinson as one of my top edge rushers as early as like mid-February, so the fact that he's now in April, a potential first round pick kind of makes this one maybe not so true, but I still wanted to throw him in here in case you guys were unaware of Braden Swinson. I think Braden Swinson is fantastic. If you ask me who would I rather have, Michael Williams or Braden Swinson, I think I might lean towards Braden Swinson, even though I think Michael might have a higher ceiling. I think I just might go Braden Braden Swinson. Braden Swinson is well sized, about 6'4", 255, long, lengthy, fairly solid athlete, moves his frame really nicely. He's built exceptionally well. And at the NFL level, those are all prototypical things you want to see. Braden Swinson to me is just what I like to call a classic disruptor. Like, he is consistently in the backfield every single play. He's also, for his position, oddly smart and crafty. Like, sometimes you have these big edge rushers who are just so physically gifted that they can destroy defensive linemen with their physical tools. Braden Swinson beats them with a number of different ways, whether it's his pass rush technique, his acceleration, his motor, his ability to always know where the quarterback is. Like, that is what Braden Swinson is. He is a classic disruptor who has proven productivity, and I love his game, man. I just absolutely love him. Good size, moves very nicely. I think maybe at the NFL level, you'd like to see him have a bit more of a pass rush plan every single down, because there are certain times where it feels like he doesn't have a plan and rather relies on just creating disruption rather than actually putting together a solid plan to get to the quarterback. But if you give this guy, who I think right now is a moldable piece of clay, a really good defensive coordinator, a really good defensive line coach who can teach him the nuances of the position, I think Braden Swinson has an incredibly high ceiling to potentially be an 8+ sack per season type of guy. Like, to put context into how good of a disruptor he actually was, I went on NFL draft analysis where you can kind of look at some of his statistics from the combine. One of his strengths, and this is something that I don't really see too often from defensive linemen, is protection struggled to keep him out of the backfield. That means that he's winning 99% of the time when he's out there. Even if he doesn't get to the quarterback or even touch the quarterback, the fact that he is getting into the backfield, forcing the quarterback to step into the pocket, which might allow another edge rusher to get in underneath and get a sack there, or allowing those big interior defensive linemen to step in and pat the ball down or put pressure on the quarterback. Like, Braden Swinson to me is somebody who could play off the edge in like a 3-4 system as like an off-ball outside linebacker, and is just going to be a classic disruptor who every NFL team would want to have. Again, do I think his upside is as high as other players? Probably not. Like, Shamar Stewart has a higher ceiling but a much lower floor. Braden Swinson to me is extremely safe. I know what I'm going to be getting out of him, but at the same time, he also does have that next level he can go to if he does improve his pass rush strategy and maybe a couple technique things here and there. So Braden Swinson is my number one. Again, not sure how hidden he is at this point because a lot of people know about him, but you guys let me know in the comment section below. And if you guys have any other hidden gems, let me know. Love you guys. Peace.